the year 496 since the Nativity of Christ. Gaul, the battlefield of Tolbiac. The air, thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and heated iron, trembled with frenzied cruelties. Two armies, two barbarian wills had clashed in a mortal struggle that was to decide whose name would be carved on the tablets of future centuries, and whose would be erased and forgotten. On one side were the ferocious, merciless Alemanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes that had poured across the Rhine, bringing fire and devastation. On the other side were the Franks, led by their young, ambitious, and still pagan king. His name was Clovis. The battle was going disastrously for the Franks. Their ranks wavered, and the warriors began to retreat, mingling in a bloody chaos. It seemed another push and all would be over. Defeat was imminent, and in this moment of desperation, when his gods, Odin, Thor, and the entire pantheon of Germanic ancestors seemed deaf to his pleas, Clovis, raising his eyes to the leaden sky, did something that was destined to change not only the course of this battle but the entire course of European history. He prayed to a foreign god, to the god of his wife, the Burgundian princess Clotilde. To the god he had hitherto despised as the god of the weak, a crucified god. He called upon Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde named the Son of the living God. He asked him who, they say, helps the afflicted and grants victory to those who trust in him, to humbly show his glory. Clovis swore that if he granted him victory over these enemies and he experienced his power, which the people consecrated in his name had experienced, he would believe in him and be baptized in his name. For he had called upon his own gods, but as he saw they were unwilling to help him, therefore he thought they were powerless, since they did not come to the aid of those who served them. He said that now he called upon him. In him he wished to believe, if only he could be delivered from his enemies. And in that same instant, as the chronicler Gregory of Tours tells us, a miracle occurred. The Alemanni, already anticipating victory, suddenly faltered. Their chieftain was struck down. Terror and confusion seized their ranks, and they turned in a panicked flight. The Franks, inspired by the divine intervention, rushed in pursuit, slaughtering the enemy. The victory was complete and crushing. Clovis stood on the field strewn with bodies and looked at the sky that had just answered his prayer. No one yet knew, not his warriors, not the vanquished enemies, not even he himself, that on this day, on the bloody field of Tolbiac, the first stone was laid in the foundation of what would, centuries later, become France. On this day, a pagan barbarian chief began his long and winding path to becoming a new Constantine, the founder of the first Orthodox Christian kingdom on the ruins of the Roman Empire. To understand the greatness of this moment, we must immerse ourselves in the world from which he emerged. In a world of a dying empire and nascent nations, a world of cruel warriors and wise bishops, a world where the sword and the cross intertwined to forge a new civilization. Before we begin the story of Clovis himself, it is necessary to paint a picture of the world in which he was destined to be born and to act. It was a world of twilight, a world of decay and fermentation, a world where the ghosts of the past still wandered among the newborn monsters of the future. The second half of the 5th century was a time when the colossus that had ruled the world for 5 centuries was crumbling. The Western Roman Empire was in its death throes, but its death was not sudden. It was a long, painful process of disintegration, like the slow decay of a gigantic organism. Imagine Gaul, once one of the richest and most Romanized provinces, called the Pearl of the Empire. Imagine its magnificent cities with forums, theaters, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and baths. Imagine its paved roads along which legions, merchants, and officials moved tirelessly, weaving the province into a single economic and cultural fabric. By the 5th century, only shadows of this splendor remained. The cities had fallen into decline. Their populations, fleeing the burden of taxes and barbarian raids, had escaped to the countryside under the protection of large landowners. Aqueducts were destroyed, baths grew cold, and majestic public buildings fell into ruin or were dismantled for stone to build crude defensive walls hastily erected around shrunken city centers. The economy had collapsed. The complex system, based on Mediterranean trade, monetary circulation, and regional specialization, had disintegrated. Hyperinflation had made coins practically useless and society regressed, returning to an agrarian subsistence economy. The huge villa estates belonging to the Gallo-Roman senatorial aristocracy turned into self-sufficient economic units, producing everything they needed for themselves and almost nothing for sale. The roads became dangerous, patrolled not by legionaries but by robber bands. Bridges collapsed. Trade came to a standstill. This was not only an economic but also a psychological collapse. For generations who had grown up in the shadow of the Pax Romana, even a fading one, the disappearance of the imperial order meant the end of the world. The very concept of civilization, of predictability, of law was crumbling. The world was filled with fear of barbarians, of robbers, of famine, of the wrath of God. In this general sense of decline, the only island of stability and hope that remained was the Church. On this depopulated and ravaged land, Roman authority had become a fiction. The emperors sitting in Ravenna were merely puppets in the hands of their barbarian military commanders of Germanic origin who bore Roman titles like Magister Militum or Patrician. Real power on the ground passed to those who could hold it by force. These were, on the one hand, the same Gallo-Roman magnates who owned huge latifundia and maintained their own private armies, known as bucellarii. On the other hand, and this was far more important, power passed to the new masters of Gaul, the Germanic tribes. They came wave after wave, driven by climate change, pressure from other tribes from the east, and the allure of a weakened but still rich empire. First, in the early 5th century came the Visigoths. After sacking Rome in 410, they, by agreement with the imperial government, settled in Aquitaine in southwestern Gaul as foederati, that is, allies, obliged to perform military service in exchange for land. But very soon they created their own, effectively independent kingdom with its capital in Toulouse, which by the end of the century stretched from the Loire to Gibraltar. In the southeast, in the Rhone Valley, the Burgundians settled, also as foederati. They founded their kingdom with its center in Lyon and Geneva. From the north and east, raids by the Alemanni and Thuringians were a constant threat. And amidst this chaos, in northeastern Gaul along the Rhine lived the Franks. This was not a single people but a confederation of various Germanic tribes united by a common name. They were divided into two large groups, the Ripuarian or river Franks who lived along the middle Rhine near Cologne, and the Salian or coastal Franks who inhabited the coast of the North Sea in the lands of modern Belgium and the Netherlands. It was to the latter that Clovis's family belonged. The Franks, unlike the Goths and Burgundians, did not undertake distant migrations. They slowly but surely, over decades, seeped into Roman territory, settled on it, served in the Roman army, and gradually occupied deserted lands. They were both enemies and allies of Rome. Many Roman commanders came from their ranks. They were known for their belligerence, ferocity, and loyalty to their chieftains. And there was another force that, in this world of decay, was, on the contrary, strengthening and gaining weight, the Christian Church. The bishops seated in the old Roman cities were becoming not only spiritual pastors but also real administrators, in the conditions of the collapse of secular authority. It was they who organized the defense of cities, fed the hungry, and negotiated with barbarian chieftains. Often coming from the same senatorial aristocratic families as the magnates, they possessed education, authority, and organizational skills. The Church was the only institution that had preserved the Roman organizational structure, writing, the Latin language, and most importantly the idea of a single universal order. However, the church itself was divided by a most profound dogmatic dispute. The vast majority of the Gallo-Roman population professed Orthodox Nicene Christianity, established at the First Council of Nicaea in 325. They believed in the Holy Trinity, that the Son is consubstantial with the Father, which in Greek is homoousios. But almost all the Germanic tribes that had already accepted Christianity, such as the Goths, Burgundians, and Vandals, were Arians. Arianism, named after the Alexandrian priest Arius, was condemned as a heresy. The Arians believed that the Son is not equal, not consubstantial with the Father, but is his highest creation, a mediator between God and the world. For Orthodox Christians, this was a terrible blasphemy, a diminution of Christ's divinity. This religious chasm created an insurmountable barrier between the Arian Germanic rulers and their numerous Catholic subjects. They lived in the same state but belonged to different worlds, prayed in different churches, and looked at each other with suspicion. And only the Franks in this complex mosaic remained pagans. They worshipped their old gods, Wodan, that is Odin, Donar, that is Thor, gods of war, fertility, and nature. This paganism of theirs paradoxically would become their main trump card in the future. Upon accepting Christianity, they would be able to accept it directly in its orthodox Nicene form, bypassing the Arian heresy. This would allow them to become one of their own for the Gallo-Roman population and its powerful episcopate. It was into such a world, at the crossroads of civilizations in an era of great change, that around the year 466 a boy was born who was destined to gather the fragments of a dying empire and create from them a new barbarian but now Christian kingdom. And while the great kingdoms of the Visigoths and Burgundians were carving up the map of southern Gaul, in the shady forests of the north, far from the splendor of the old Roman cities, a clan shrouded in the mists of legends ruled. This was the Merovingians, the dynasty from which Clovis descended. Their power was based not only on the strength of the sword, but also on a sacred, almost mystical authority, rooted in the deep pagan past. The main external sign of the Merovingians, their sacred symbol, was their long hair. While ordinary Frankish warriors cut their hair short at the nape, leaving only a forelock, the kings of the Merovingian line never cut their hair from birth. Long hair falling to their shoulders was considered not just a sign of royal dignity, but the physical embodiment of their magical power and luck, the so-called heal or mana. This power ensured the fertility of the fields, the fruitfulness of livestock, and victory in battles. To cut a Merovingian's hair meant to deprive him of this power, of his royal status, to commit a terrible sacrilege. This tradition was so strong that a deposed king was not killed but tonsured as a monk, which was equivalent to political and spiritual death. The dynasty itself traced its origin to a legendary ancestor, Merovec, who gave it its name. We know almost nothing about Merovec. Whether he was a real historical figure or a mythical one is hard to say. The 7th century chronicler Fredegar recounts a wondrous legend of his birth. Supposedly, Merovec's mother, the wife of King Clodio, while bathing in the sea, was seduced by a sea monster, a beast of Neptune, similar to a Kinotaur. From this union, Merovec was born, in whose veins the blood of Frankish kings and a mysterious sea deity was mixed. This legend, of course, is not a historical fact, but it perfectly illustrates the aura of the supernatural with which the Merovingians surrounded their origins. They were not just chieftains, they were bearers of divine grace, descendants of gods. Their power was personal, not territorial. They were kings of the Franks, not kings of France, and the people followed them in search of glory and booty. The center of this society was the free warrior. His main occupation was war, and his main desire was rich booty, which a successful chieftain would distribute. The core of the Frankish army was the infantry, which fought in a dense formation known as a wedge or a shield wall. Their armament was simple but deadly. Each warrior had a large round or oval wooden shield, a long spear for close combat, and a short sword called a scramasex. But the most formidable and famous weapon of the Franks was the throwing axe, the francisca. This axe, with its characteristic S-shaped blade, was thrown with terrifying force and accuracy just before hand-to-hand combat, capable of splitting a shield or a skull. Another fearsome weapon was the angon, a throwing spear with a long iron head and barbs. Once it pierced an enemy's shield, the angon made it difficult to lift, and it was impossible to pull out. Thus the Frankish warrior deprived his enemy of protection, after which he would charge into a furious attack. It was with such warriors that Clovis would begin his conquests. A more historical figure is Clovis's father, Childeric I. He was the king of the Salian Franks, with his center in the city of Tournai, in modern-day Belgium. Childeric was not a great conqueror, but he was a cunning politician and a successful military commander. He acted as a Roman foederatus commander, fighting sometimes on the side of the Romans against the Visigoths, sometimes with them against Saxon pirates. He was a classic barbarian chieftain of a transitional era, balancing between serving Rome and defending the interests of his tribe. Gregory of Tours tells another colorful story about his life. Supposedly, Childeric was so licentious and seduced the daughters of noble Franks that his subjects exiled him. He fled to Thuringia, to the court of King Basine. There he seduced Basine's wife, Queen Basina. After 8 years, the Franks, tired of the rule of the Roman commander Aegidius, whom they had elected in Childeric's place, called their king back. And soon Basina also came to him from Thuringia, having left her husband. When the surprised Childeric asked why she had come, Basina allegedly replied that she knew his valor and knew that he was very strong, and so she had come to live with him. She said that he should know, if she had learned that in overseas lands there was anyone more worthy than him, she would have made every effort to live with him. From this union of Childeric and Basina, Clovis was born. This story, like many others in Gregory of Tours, is most likely a folkloric anecdote, but it underscores the Merovingians' reputation as men marked by a special strength and charisma which even queens could not resist. Archaeology tells us much more than these dubious legends. In 1653, in the city of Tournai, during the construction of an almshouse, the untouched tomb of Childeric was accidentally discovered. It was one of the greatest archaeological finds of its time. In the tomb, besides the king's remains, an incredible amount of treasure was found. His body was clad in a Roman general's cloak, the paludamentum, fastened with a golden fibula. Beside him lay his weapons, a spatha sword and a francisca battle-axe with richly gold-decorated handles. On his finger was a golden signet ring with his image and the inscription, Childerici Regis, of King Childeric. He was depicted as a Frankish warrior with long hair and a spear, but dressed as a Roman general. The tomb also contained hundreds of gold coins, Byzantine and Roman gold and garnet jewelry, buckles and bracelets, and most surprisingly more than 300 gold bees or perhaps cicadas with garnet inlays which probably adorned his burial cloak. These treasures, most of which were unfortunately stolen from a Paris library in 1831 and melted down, tell us a great deal about the world of Childeric and Clovis. They show a syncretism, a mixture of Roman and Germanic cultures. Childeric was buried as a Germanic chieftain, with his horse and weapons, but with the attributes of Roman authority. He was both a rex, king of the Franks, and a Roman general. His wealth testifies to his successful military campaigns and to the fact that he controlled important trade routes. The golden bees from his tomb made such an impression on Napoleon Bonaparte that he, seeking to connect his new empire with the most ancient roots of France, chose them as his personal symbol, replacing the royal lilies of the Bourbons. In 481 or 482, Childeric died. Power over his small kingdom of Salian Franks, located in the territory of modern Belgium and northeastern France, passed to his son, a 15-year-old youth named Clovis. No one then could have imagined that this youth, one of many petty barbarian kings, would in 30 years of his reign unite almost all of Gaul under his rule and create the most powerful and durable of all the barbarian kingdoms. Ascending his father's throne, the young Clovis inherited a small kingdom. His domains stretched from Tournai to Cambrai. He was just one of several Frankish kings ruling their tribes. To his east sat other Merovingians, Childeric, Ragnacar in Cambrai, and Sigobert the Lame in Cologne. But the young wolf's gaze was not on his kinsmen. He looked south, to the rich and still Romanized lands between the rivers Somme and Loire. These lands represented the last fragment of the Roman Empire in Gaul. Here, after the fall of Ravenna in 476, a Roman commander named Syagrius continued to rule. Gregory of Tours calls him the king of the Romans, Deus Rex Romanorum in Latin, although Syagrius himself most likely continued to bear the Roman title of Magister Militum, or patrician. His father, Aegidius, had been the last legitimate Roman military commander in Gaul, and after his death, Syagrius inherited power over this territory. His so-called kingdom, with its center in the city of Soissons, was an enclave, squeezed between the Franks to the north and the Visigoths to the south. Syagrius commanded the remnants of the Roman field army in Gaul, and relied on the support of the local Gallo-Roman aristocracy and bishops. He was the last representative of legitimate Roman authority in this land, and for Clovis he was the first and main target. The reasons for this were obvious. Syagrius's lands were rich and fertile. Their capture would give Clovis access to the resources needed to maintain and expand his warband. Moreover, a victory over the last Roman ruler would immeasurably raise his authority among other Frankish chieftains. It was a daring but well-calculated move. Clovis did not act alone. He made an alliance with his relative, King Ragnacar of Cambrai. In 486, having assembled a combined army, Clovis, who was only 20, invaded Syagrius's domains. Syagrius accepted the challenge. The two armies met on a battlefield near Soissons. We know very little about the battle itself. Gregory of Tours reports it in just one sentence, that in the 5th year of his reign, Clovis went to war against Syagrius and, having engaged him in battle, defeated him utterly. But behind this laconic phrase lies an event of immense significance. The barbarian army of the Franks, consisting mainly of infantry armed with Francisca axes, angons, spears, and swords, crushed the last regular Roman army in Gaul. It was the end. 500 years of Roman rule in northern Gaul ended on the field near Soissons. The defeated Syagrius fled. He sought refuge with the Visigothic king Alaric II in Toulouse, hoping that one Germanic king would not hand over a Roman aristocrat to another, but he was mistaken. Alaric did not want to quarrel with the young and aggressive Frankish chieftain. When Clovis sent envoys demanding the fugitives' surrender, threatening war otherwise, Alaric, fearing the Franks' wrath, ordered Syagrius to be put in chains and handed over to Clovis. Shortly thereafter, Clovis ordered Syagrius to be secretly stabbed with a sword. The young wolf had shown his teeth. He was not only a brave warrior, but also a ruthless politician who did not leave his enemies alive. The capture of Syagrius's kingdom was Clovis's first step towards greatness. He gained control over a vast territory, including important cities like Soissons, Paris, and Rouen. But it was the events that immediately followed the battle that best show us the complex character of this man and his era. And key here is the famous story of the Vase of Soissons. It seems a simple story about the division of spoils. But in it, as in a drop of water, is reflected the entire essence of the nascent monarchy, the clash of two worlds, two legal systems, ancient Germanic custom and the new sole will of the king. This story, told by Gregory of Tours with such drama, became one of the foundational myths of French history. So after the victory at Soissons, the Franks, according to their custom, began to plunder the conquered territory. Among other booty seized from a church was a certain vase of amazing beauty and size. At that moment, a messenger from the Bishop of Reims, Saint Remigius, approached Clovis. Remigius was one of the most influential figures in northern Gaul. He was not just a bishop. He was a wise and far-sighted politician who understood that the future of Gaul belonged to the Franks, and he had already begun to establish relations with their young pagan king. His appeal was not just a request to return church utensils. It was a subtle political probe, a test to see if this barbarian chieftain was capable of dialogue and respect for the church. The bishop asked Clovis to return at least this vase, so that it would not be lost to the church. And here Clovis found himself in a difficult situation. According to ancient Frankish custom, all war booty was considered common. The king, as a military leader, had no right to a larger share than any other warrior. Everything was decided by lot. He could not simply order the vase to be given away. But he wanted to please the powerful bishop. He addressed his warriors with a request to give him, in addition to his share, this vessel as well. Most of the warriors, who respected their king and his luck, replied that the glorious king could do whatever he pleased, for no one could oppose his power. They were already prepared to recognize his right to stand above custom. But then a loud and defiant voice was heard. One of the warriors, a frivolous, envious, and hot-tempered man, raised his Francisca battle-axe and with a cry declared that the king would get from here only what was his by lot. With these words, he struck the vase, leaving a dent in it. The entire troop froze. It was an unheard-of insult. It was a challenge thrown not just to a chieftain, but to the bearer of sacred royal authority. But Clovis, as Gregory writes, suppressed his resentment with patience. He silently took the damaged vase and gave it to the bishop's messenger, harboring a deep grudge in his soul. A year passed. Clovis, as was customary, held a review of his army on the Campus Martius. Walking along the ranks of warriors, he checked the condition of their weapons. Coming to the very warrior who had struck the vase, he told him that no one kept his weapons in such poor condition as he. Neither his spear, nor his sword, nor his axe was any good. With these words, he tore the warrior's axe from his hand and threw it to the ground. And when the man bent down to pick it up, Clovis raised his own Francisca and brought it down on the warrior's head with all his might, splitting his skull. And over the fallen body he uttered cold and terrible words that the entire army heard. "Thus did you do to that vase in Soissons." This brutal act was not just revenge, it was a political lesson taught to the entire tribe. Clovis had clearly demonstrated that from now on, his will stood above ancient law. He showed that he was not just the first among equals like the old Germanic kings. He was a king whose authority was absolute and whose insult was punishable by death. It is said that after this incident, no one ever dared to contradict his will again. The terror he inspired became one of the foundations of his power. But this story also shows another, no less important side of his character. He knew how to wait. He did not enter into open conflict when the law was on his offender's side. He waited for a moment when he could punish him for another, formally legal reason, for neglecting his weapons. This speaks of his cunning, composure, and political calculation. And finally, this story shows the beginning of his rapprochement with the Gallo-Roman Church. He was still a pagan, but he already understood the advantage that could be gained from an alliance with the bishops. He returned the vase, and this gesture was undoubtedly appreciated by Remigius and his brethren. The seeds of a future alliance had been sown. While Clovis was asserting his power in the north with the force of arms and brutal lessons, in the kingdom of the Burgundians, which stretched across southeastern Gaul, a girl was growing up who was destined to become his wife and forever change his fate. Her name was Clotilde. She was not just a princess, she was the bearer of a different faith and a different destiny, which, intertwined with Clovis's destiny, would create a new reality. Clotilde was the daughter of the Burgundian king Childeric II. The Burgundians, like the Visigoths, were Arians. But Chilperic's family, under the influence of his wife Aquitaine, secretly or openly professed Orthodox Nicene Christianity. Thus Clotilde was raised in the Catholic faith from childhood, being a kind of stranger at her own Arian court. Her childhood was marred by a bloody tragedy typical of barbarian royal houses. Her father, Chilperic, was killed by his own brother Gundobad, who, striving for sole power, also drowned Chilperic's wife by tying a stone to her neck, and sent his two daughters, Clotilde and her sister Crona, into exile. Crona entered a convent while Clotilde lived at the court of her uncle murderer, harboring a grudge and waiting for her moment. Clovis, by then already the most powerful ruler in northern Gaul, decided he needed a wife of royal blood. He already had a concubine who had borne him a son, Theuderic, but to strengthen his status he needed a legitimate marriage to a princess. And his choice fell on Clotilde. Why her? It was a subtle political calculation. Firstly, a marriage to a Burgundian princess would create an important strategic alliance against their common enemy, the powerful kingdom of the Visigoths. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, Clotilde was a Catholic. Clovis, ruling over an increasing number of Gallo-Roman subjects, could not fail to understand the advantage that a marriage to a co-religionist of his new population would bring him. Perhaps his advisors from the Gallo-Roman aristocracy and the same Bishop Remigius also pushed him towards this marriage. Gregory of Tours tells a beautiful, almost fairy tale-like story about this betrothal. Supposedly, Clovis, having heard of Clotilde's beauty and intelligence, secretly sent his envoy, a Roman named Aurelian, to her. Disguised as a beggar, Aurelian entered the palace where Clotilde lived and, during her visit to the church, managed to give her Clovis's ring as a sign of his proposal. Clotilde, understanding that this was her only chance to escape from her uncle's power and avenge her family, gladly accepted. She gave Aurelian her own ring and asked him to hurry. Upon learning of Clovis's proposal, Gundobad was furious. His advisors warned him not to give the girl to this Frank, for if he gave him his niece, he and all his people would come and take his land from him. But fearing Clovis's power, he did not dare to refuse. He agreed to the marriage and sent Clotilde with a rich dowry to her fiancé. What followed resembles an adventure novel. Clotilde, fearing that her uncle might change his mind and bring her back, begged her Frankish escorts to travel as fast as possible. She got into a covered wagon, a carpentum, and rushed towards the border, and not in vain. Gundobad did indeed regret his decision and sent a pursuit after her, but it was too late. Clotilde had managed to cross the border and was on Frankish territory. Seeing this, she ordered part of the Burgundian land to be burned to symbolically cut off her path back. The pursuit returned with nothing. Clovis, as Gregory writes, met his bride with great joy and soon they were married. This happened around the year 493. This marriage became a turning point in Clovis's life and in the history of his kingdom. Clotilde was not just a wife. She was a missionary. From the first day of their life together, she tirelessly urged her pagan husband to accept her faith. She told him of the powerlessness of his idols, made of wood and stone, and of the omnipotence of the one Creator God who made heaven and earth. When their first son was born, she insisted that he be baptized. Clovis, though reluctantly, agreed. But shortly after baptism, the infant, who was named in Gomer, fell ill and died, still in his white baptismal robes. For Clovis, this was a terrible blow and proof of the correctness of his pagan beliefs. He angrily lashed out at his wife, saying that if the boy had been dedicated to his gods, he would have lived, but since he was baptized in the name of her god, he could not live. But Clotilde did not despair. She prayed and thanked God that he had at least deemed her firstborn worthy of being received into the kingdom of heaven. When their second son, Clodomir, was born, she again insisted on baptism, and this boy also fell gravely ill. Clovis was already certain that this child too would die, and again reproached his wife. But Clotilde prayed fervently, and according to the chronicler, the boy recovered. Despite this, Clovis remained adamant. He respected his wife's faith, but had no intention of abandoning the gods of his ancestors. For that, something more than entreaties and family dramas was needed. A sign from above was needed. A divine intervention on the battlefield. And this intervention was not long in coming. It seemed that Gaul was, for a time, frozen in a fragile balance. Clovis had consolidated his power in the north. The Burgundians and Visigoths ruled in the south, but beneath the surface, forces were maturing, ready to shatter this order. And soon the thunder would strike. Around the year 496, a new wave of Germanic invaders, the Alemanni, fell upon the northeastern borders of the Frankish Kingdom. The Alemanni were a fierce and warlike people. They occupied the territories of modern southwestern Germany, Switzerland, and Alsace. Their raids posed a mortal threat not only to Clovis's Salian Franks, but also to their kinsmen, the Ripuarian Franks, who lived near Cologne. Their king, Sigebert, nicknamed the Lame because of a knee wound, appealed to Clovis for help. Clovis, understanding that he could not cope alone, agreed to an alliance. The two Frankish armies united to repel the common enemy. The decisive battle took place at a site the chronicles call Tolbiac, now the city of Zulpich near Cologne. The battle was incredibly fierce. As Gregory of Tours writes, a cruel slaughter occurred, and Clovis's army was on the verge of complete annihilation. The Franks, unable to withstand the onslaught, began to retreat. Catastrophe seemed imminent. It was at this moment of desperation that the scene described in the prologue occurred. Clovis, seeing the powerlessness of his pagan gods, turned in prayer to the god of Clotilde. And a miracle occurred. The tide of battle turned. The Alemanni, having lost their king, wavered and fled. The Franks' victory was complete. Clovis had not only saved his kingdom, but had also subjected a significant part of the Alemanni lands, extending his influence far beyond the Rhine. But the main result of this battle was not a territorial gain, it was a spiritual victory. Clovis had made a vow, and now he had to fulfill it. Returning home, he told Clotilde of his oath and the miraculous victory. The queen, immensely happy, immediately sent for the bishop of Reims, Saint Remigius. Preparations began for the greatest of events. Remigius, that wise pastor, began to instruct the king in the fundamentals of the Christian faith. But Clovis faced another very important task. He was not just a man. He was the king of a barbarian tribe. He could not be baptized alone. He needed the consent of his people, his warriors. He gathered the Franks and addressed them with a speech. But as it turned out, his fears were unfounded. The divine intervention at Tolbiac had made no less an impression on the warriors than on their king. Even before he finished speaking, the army exclaimed with one voice that they, gracious king, renounce mortal gods and are ready to follow the immortal God whom Remigius preaches. And so, on Christmas Day, 496, although some historians date this event later, as late as 508, in the city of Reims, everything was ready for the ceremony. The streets were decorated with colorful carpets, the churches with white curtains. The baptistry was filled with incense, wax candles burned in it, And as the chronicler writes, the whole place was filled with such a divine fragrance that those present thought they were amidst the aromas of paradise. Clovis, that recent pagan, the long-haired barbarian chieftain, entered the baptistery. Struck by the splendor of the ceremony, he asked the bishop if this was the kingdom of heaven he had been promised. Remigius replied that no, this was only the beginning of the path that leads to it. And then as the king approached the font, the bishop uttered the famous words that have entered all history textbooks. He called on the proud Sicamber to bow his neck humbly, to adore what he had burned and to burn what he had adored. Clovis, the mighty warrior, bowed his head and entered the water. He was baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Following him, his 2 sisters and more than 3,000 of his warriors were baptized. Later, a legend was born that became central to the French monarchy. Supposedly, at the moment of baptism, when the holy oil for anointing could not be found, a dove flew down from heaven and brought in its beak a vial, the holy ampulla, with divine oil. It was with this oil that all French kings, right up to the 19th century, would be anointed at their coronations, emphasizing the divine origin of their power, which began with Clovis. The significance of this event cannot be overestimated. The baptism of Clovis was not just an act of personal faith, it was a brilliant political move. Firstly, by accepting Christianity precisely in its orthodox, Nicene form, Clovis became the only Catholic ruler among all the Germanic kings in Gaul. All the others, Visigoths and Burgundians, were Arians, that is, in the eyes of the local Gallo-Roman population and its powerful church hierarchy, heretics. Clovis instantly transformed from a barbarian invader into a defender of the true faith, one of their own for the millions of Catholics living under Arian rule. Secondly, he gained a most powerful ally in the Gallo-Roman Church. The bishops henceforth saw him as their patron and liberator. They opened the gates of cities to him, supported him with their wealth, their organizational structure, and their influence over the population. The alliance of the Merovingian sword and the Catholic cross became the foundation on which the Frankish Kingdom was built. Thirdly, this event had immense significance for all of Europe. The Frankish Kingdom became the first barbarian state to adopt Catholicism. This predetermined the future religious map of Europe. The Pope of Rome, who was in a difficult position at the time, oppressed by the Arian rulers of Italy, found in Clovis and his successors a powerful protector in the north. The alliance of the Frankish kings and the Roman See would become one of the main axes of European politics for many centuries to come. The reaction of the Catholic world was immediate and enthusiastic. It was best expressed by Bishop Avitus of Vienne. Although a subject of the Arian Burgundian king Gundobad, Avitus secretly sent a congratulatory letter to Clovis, which is a priceless testimony of the era. He wrote that Clovis's faith was their victory. For Avitus, Clovis's baptism was not just a political act, but a miracle, a divine intervention in history. He compared Clovis's choice to a judgment at which the king, having heard different opinions, chose the truth, and now his authority would compel others to follow him. The bishop wrote that Greece, meaning the Eastern Roman Empire, could rejoice in having a co-religionist emperor, but the world would henceforth rejoice that God had given it such a ruler as Clovis. This letter is not just flattery. It is a recognition that Clovis had become the leader and hope of all the Catholics of the West, even those who lived outside his kingdom. It was a carte blanche for future wars against the heretics. Clovis had become, in the Pope's expression, a new Constantine. Like the first Christian emperor, he was to unite the scattered lands and peoples under his rule by force of arms and faith. The baptism in Reims was not the end, but the beginning of his great journey. Now, having become God's anointed in the eyes of the Catholic clergy, Clovis could begin to carry out his main mission, the unification of Gaul under his rule. His main rivals in the south were the Burgundians and the Visigoths. Both were Arians, which gave Clovis a perfect ideological pretext for war. He could now present his campaigns of conquest as a holy war, as the liberation of Orthodox Catholics from the yoke of heretics. His first target was the Burgundians. Here, a family feud helped him. His wife Clotilde had not forgotten that her uncle Gundobad had killed her father. Moreover, Gundobad had a brother and co-ruler named Godegisel, who himself dreamed of sole power. Godegisel secretly sent envoys to Clovis proposing an alliance. He promised that if Clovis helped him in pursuing his brother, he would pay him any annual tribute that he himself would set. Clovis agreed. In the year 500, he invaded Burgundy. Gundobad and Godegisel marched out against him with combined forces. But when the Battle of Dijon began, Godegisel, as agreed, struck his brother from the rear. Gundobad, attacked from two sides, was defeated and fled to Avignon. Clovis pursued him and besieged him in the city. It seemed the kingdom of the Burgundians had come to an end. But Gundobad was a cunning politician. Finding himself in a hopeless situation, he managed to reach an agreement with Clovis. He promised to pay him an annual tribute. Clovis, perhaps not wanting to excessively strengthen his treacherous ally Godegisel, agreed and lifted the siege. As soon as the Franks had left, Gundobad gathered new forces, besieged his brother in the city of Vienne, captured him, and executed him. He once again became the sole ruler of Burgundy. Although Clovis had not been able to destroy the Burgundian kingdom, he had seriously weakened it and forced it to pay tribute. The complete subjugation of Burgundy would be the work of his sons. Now his gaze turned to his main enemy, the powerful and vast kingdom of the Visigoths. The Visigothic kingdom, with its capital in Toulouse, occupied all of southwestern Gaul, that is, Aquitaine, and most of Spain. It was the richest, most cultured, and strongest of all the barbarian states. Its king, Alaric II, was a powerful ruler, but he had one serious weakness. The vast majority of his subjects in Gaul were Gallo-Romans and Catholics, while the ruling Visigothic elite was Arian. Clovis began the ideological preparation for war. At an assembly of his warriors, he delivered a fiery speech which Gregory of Tours has passed down to us. In it he said how very vexing it was to him that these Arians held a part of Gaul. He called on them to go against them with God's help and, having defeated them, to subject their land to Frankish rule. This speech was met with enthusiastic shouts. The war for the rich lands of Aquitaine was presented as a godly cause. The Catholic clergy in the lands of the Visigoths openly sympathized with Clovis. Alaric, sensing the threat, tried to pursue a more conciliatory policy, even allowing a Catholic council to be held at Agde. He also tried to resolve the matter peacefully, arranging a meeting with Clovis on an island in the middle of the Loire. The kings made peace and swore friendship. But everyone understood that this was just a temporary respite. A clash was inevitable. The powerful Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy and was the father-in-law of both kings, tried to mediate, urging them to peace, but his efforts were in vain. In 507, Clovis, having assembled a huge army, marched south. His campaign was accompanied, according to the chroniclers, by numerous divine signs. When the army approached the Vienne River, which was swollen from the rains, a hind of marvelous size supposedly appeared before them and forded the river, showing them the way. From Tours, from the Basilica of Saint Martin, the most revered saint in Gaul, a prophecy of success was sent to him. At night, a pillar of fire allegedly emanating from the basilica appeared over Clovis's camp. All this was meant to show that God himself and his saints were fighting on the side of the Franks. The decisive battle took place on the plain of Vouillé, not far from the city of Poitiers. It was one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the era. On one side were the Franks, mostly infantry full of religious enthusiasm. On the other was the Visigothic army, in which heavy cavalry played a significant role. The battle was long and stubborn. The outcome was decided by a duel between the two kings. Clovis, as Gregory writes, personally clashed with Alaric II in battle and killed him. With the death of their king, the Visigothic army wavered and fled. The Franks' victory was complete. This victory had colossal consequences. The entire Visigothic kingdom in Gaul, all of Aquitaine from the Loire to the Pyrenees, with the exception of the narrow coastal strip of Septimania, came under Clovis's rule. He captured their capital, Toulouse, and the vast treasures of the Visigothic kings. The Visigoths were pushed back beyond the Pyrenees into Spain. After this brilliant victory, Clovis received recognition from the only power that was still considered a legitimate source of supreme authority in the world: the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire. Emperor Anastasius I, who was hostile to the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, an ally of the Visigoths, gladly recognized Clovis's successes. He sent him a document in the city of Tours conferring upon him the title of consul. This was an honorary but extremely important title. In the Basilica of St. Martin, Clovis donned a purple tunic and a chlamys, the robes of a Roman consul, and placed a diadem on his head. Riding through the city, he threw gold and silver coins to the crowd. From that day on, as Gregory writes, he was called not only king, but also consul and Augustus. For his Gallo-Roman subjects, this was a sign that their new barbarian ruler was recognized as the legitimate heir to Roman authority. He ceased to be just a Germanic chieftain. He became a legitimate representative of the imperial order. Clovis's power now rested on three pillars: the strength of the Frankish sword, the blessing of the Catholic Church, and the legitimacy inherited from the Roman Empire. Clovis had conquered almost all of Gaul. He was recognized by the emperor and blessed by the Church. But his work was not yet finished. Power over the Franks was still divided. There were other Frankish kings, his relatives, who ruled their own tribes and could challenge his supremacy. And Clovis, this new Constantine, this defender of the faith, began the last, most sordid and bloody phase of his reign: the systematic elimination of all his rivals. The accounts of this, left to us by Gregory of Tours, paint a picture of a ruler who knew neither pity nor kinship, who was cunning, treacherous, and absolutely ruthless. His first target was Sigebert the Lame, the king of the Ripuarian Franks of Cologne, who had once been his ally in the war against the Alemanni. Clovis sent secret envoys to Sigebert's son, Childeric. The envoys said that his father was old and his leg was lame, and if he were to die, his kingdom, along with Clovis's friendship, would rightfully belong to Childeric. Childeric, tempted by the promises, yielded to their persuasion. When his father Sigebert went hunting in the forest, Childeric sent assassins to him who dealt with the old man. After this, he sent envoys to Clovis with the words that his father was dead, and he had taken possession of his kingdom and his treasury. He asked Clovis to send envoys, and he would gladly send him whatever he liked from the treasures. Clovis sent his envoys. But when Childeric was showing them the treasures of his murdered father and, bending down, was taking gold from a deep chest, one of the envoys raised his axe and split his skull. Thus the parricide was punished by the hands of the one who had incited him to the crime. When news of this reached the Ripuarian Franks, Clovis came to them and declared that he had no part in these murders. But since it had happened, he offered them his protection and patronage. The Ripuarian Franks, left without a king, raised him on a shield and proclaimed him their ruler. Gregory of Tours concludes that thus Clovis daily exterminated his enemies and expanded his kingdom. For he walked with an upright heart before the Lord and did what was pleasing in his sight. This last phrase sounds like a grim irony, but it reflects the chronicler's worldview. Even the most heinous crimes can be justified if they serve the cause of uniting a Christian kingdom. The next victim was Childeric, another Frankish king. During Clovis's war with Syagrius, Childeric, waiting to see which side would win, had come to the aid of neither. Clovis did not forgive him for this. He captured Childeric and his son and ordered their hair to be cut, making one a priest and the other a deacon. This was political death. But when Childeric and his son in their humiliation were complaining to each other and saying that their green branches had been cut down and they hoped they would grow back, these words were reported to Clovis. He understood that they had not submitted and would wait for a chance for revenge. Without much thought, he ordered them both to be beheaded and took possession of their kingdom. Then it was the turn of Ragnacar, the king of Cambrai, his relative and former ally. Gregory describes Ragnacar as a debauched and greedy man, but this may just be an attempt to justify Clovis's actions. Clovis bribed Ragnacar's commanders, sending them golden bracelets and sword belts that were, however, made of gilded copper. Then he moved his army against Ragnacar. Betrayed by his own men, Ragnacar and his brother Richer were captured and brought to Clovis with their hands bound. Clovis addressed him mockingly, asking why he had shamed their family by allowing himself to be bound, and that it would have been better for him to die. And he split his head with an axe. Then, turning to his brother, he added that if he had helped his brother, he would not have been bound, and he killed him with an axe as well. After this, the treacherous commanders discovered that the gold Clovis had given them was fake. When they complained to him, he replied with icy calm that such gold was worthy of one who willingly betrays his master to death, and they should be glad he had granted them their lives. After this, he also ordered another of their brothers, Rignomer, to be killed in the city of Le Mans. Thus, one, by cunning, betrayal, and direct violence, Clovis eliminated all his relatives, all the long-haired kings who could have competed with him. He became the sole ruler of all the Franks. Gregory of Tours concludes this bloody list with a tragic and hypocritical anecdote. Supposedly, one day Clovis, having gathered his followers, exclaimed with feigned sorrow that woe was him, for he was left like a stranger among foreigners and had no relatives who could help him in case of misfortune. But he said this, as the chronicler remarks, not because he grieved for their deaths, but out of cunning, hoping to find out if anyone else was still alive, so that he could kill him too. By the end of his reign, Clovis, who had started as a petty tribal chieftain, had become the absolute monarch of a huge kingdom stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. He had united the Franks, subjugated the Gallo-Romans, and defeated the Alemanni and Visigoths. He had laid the foundation for the most powerful state in early medieval Europe, and he had done it with hands stained with the blood not only of enemies, but also of his closest kin. Having conquered a kingdom, Clovis faced a new, no less difficult task: to govern it. He had to create a system that would ensure order and stability over a vast territory inhabited by different peoples with different customs. And here he proved himself not only a warrior, but also a wise statesman. One of his most important steps was the establishment of a new capital. He moved his court to a small but strategically well-located city on the Seine River, Lutetia or Paris. The choice was not accidental. Paris, in the past a modest Roman town that was not among the major centers of Gaul, was located at the junction of his old, northern Frankish domains and the newly conquered Gallo-Roman territories in the south. It was a center from which it was convenient to control the entire kingdom. Moreover, the city was associated with the veneration of one of the most popular saints in Gaul, Saint Genevieve, who, according to tradition, had saved the city from the invasion of Attila's Huns. By establishing himself in Paris, Clovis secured his status as the ruler of all Gaul and laid the foundation for the future rise of this city. Here, on the hill that today bears Saint Genevieve's name, he founded the Church of the Holy Apostles, where he was buried after his death. Later, this church would become the Abbey of Saint Genevieve, one of the main spiritual centers of France. But how to govern this vast territory in practice? Here, too, Clovis applied the principle of synthesis, not destroying the old but building the new on top of it. He preserved the Roman division of Gaul into city districts or civitates. But at the head of each such district, he placed his own representative, a count, in Latin, comes. The count, as a rule, was a noble Frankish warrior, loyal personally to the king. He was simultaneously a military commander who raised the militia, the supreme judge, and the tax collector. His power was a reflection of the king's power in miniature. However, next to the count in each city was the bishop. The bishop was not only a spiritual leader but also the largest landowner, the head of a ramified church organization, and most importantly, a representative of the local Gallo-Roman aristocracy, a man trusted by the indigenous population. The successful governance of Clovis's kingdom was built on a fragile but effective balance of these two forces: the Germanic military power of the count and the Roman administrative and cultural authority of the bishop. This dualism would become a characteristic feature of the entire early Middle Ages. But his most lasting legacy was not the founding of a capital, but the codification of laws. It was under Clovis that one of the most famous barbarian law codes, known as the Salic law, or Lex Salica in Latin, was compiled. This was not a new, invented code, but a written record of the ancient oral customs of the Salian Franks, made in vulgar Latin but with interspersed Frankish words. The Salic law gives us a unique opportunity to look into the world of Frankish society. It was a society of warriors and farmers where the main values were kinship and honor. The law did not provide for public punishments like imprisonment. At its core was the principle of weregild, a monetary compensation for a crime. Almost any offense, from petty theft to murder, could be atoned for by paying a certain sum of money to the victim or their family to avoid a blood feud which could destroy entire clans. This code scrupulously regulated community life. For example, the fine for stealing a 1-year-old piglet was 3 solidi, but for an adult boar from a locked sty, it was 17. The desecration of graves was punished particularly severely. Whoever dug up and robbed a buried person was declared an outlaw, and anyone could kill him with impunity. The amount of the weregild depended on the social status of the victim and the severity of the crime. Thus, for killing a simple free Frank, a fine of 200 solidi was due. For killing a count or a nobleman, 600 solidi. Interestingly, the weregild for killing a Roman landowner was half that for killing a Frank, which reflected the dominant position of the conquerors. The law detailed fines for a wide variety of offenses: for arson of a house, for cutting off a hand, 100 solidi, a leg, an eye, or a nose. There were even fines for verbal insults. Calling a free man a fox cost 3 solidi, but accusing a woman of witchcraft was much more expensive. But the most famous provision of the Salic law, which had an immense influence on all subsequent European history, was the paragraph on land inheritance. It stated that no part of the land could go to a woman, but all land inheritance passed to the male line. Initially, this provision concerned only family clan holdings, but in the 14th century, French jurists, seeking a legal justification to exclude the English king, who claimed the French crown through the female line, remembered this ancient law. They extended its application to the inheritance of the royal throne. The so-called Salic law for many centuries became the legal basis of the French monarchy, forbidding women from inheriting the crown. The ancient custom of a barbarian tree, recorded by order of Clovis, determined the fate of entire dynasties. In 511, at the age of only 45, Clovis, the unifier of Gaul, the first Christian king of the Franks, died in his new capital city of Paris. He left behind a huge, the most powerful kingdom in Europe. But he also left another legacy: which would become both the strength and the curse of his dynasty. The death of Clovis did not bring peace to his new kingdom. In accordance with Frankish custom, which viewed the kingdom not as a state but as the personal property of the monarch, it was divided among his 4 sons. Childeric, his eldest son by a concubine, received the largest eastern part with its capital at Reims, the future Austrasia. The 3 sons by Clotilde divided the rest. Clotilde received the kingdom with its center in Orléans, Childebert the kingdom of Paris, and Clotilde the kingdom with its center in Soissons, the future Neustria. This division initiated a ruinous tradition that would haunt the Merovingian dynasty throughout its history. The kingdom of the Franks would at times be united under the rule of one strong ruler, only to fall apart again, torn by fratricidal wars between heirs. The sons and grandsons of Clovis would continue his policy of conquest, subjugating Burgundy and Provence, but their constant strife would ultimately weaken the dynasty and lead to its decline, to the era of the so-called do-nothing kings, until in the 8th century they were replaced by new, energetic rulers, the Carolingians. What then is the legacy of Clovis? It is grandiose and contradictory. On the one hand, he was a typical barbarian chieftain of his era, cruel, treacherous, and ruthless. He built his kingdom on blood and betrayal, sparing neither enemies nor relatives. His personal faith, by all appearances, was pragmatic and did not prevent him from committing the gravest sins. On the other hand, he was a brilliant politician and strategist, a man of truly historical scale. In conditions of complete chaos, he managed to create a strong and viable state from disparate tribes and fragments of an empire. He understood that the future lay in an alliance of Germanic military force and Romano-Christian civilization. His baptism in Reims became one of the most important events in the history of Europe, predetermining its Catholic future. For France, Clovis is more than just a historical character. He is its godfather, its mythical founder. For centuries, French kings considered themselves his direct heirs. Their coronation ceremony took place in the same Reims cathedral. They used the lily as their symbol, which, according to one legend, was given to Clovis by an angel at his baptism. And the name Clovis or Clotilde eventually transformed into Louis, becoming the traditional name for 18 French monarchs. Even after the fall of the monarchy, his figure remained at the center of ideological disputes. For some, he was a symbol of the union of throne and altar, for others a barbarian conqueror who had enslaved the free Gauls. But whoever he was, his shadow fell forever on the land that, thanks to him, received its name, France. He was a man of a transitional era who, standing on the ruins of the old world, was able to discern the outlines of the new and, by the force of his will and his sword, turn that vision into reality. His story is an epic saga of the birth of a nation from chaos, blood, and faith. Thank you for your attention. If this story seemed interesting to you and you wish to continue delving into the most captivating and dramatic pages of the past, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this video. Many more amazing journeys through time await us.